Well, thank you again for coming this evening. It's an honor to be giving these lectures, and as Jean-Marc just said, this evening we're going to go broad. But we're going to start with the story of an individual, a fascinating story, a Reformed rabbi from Baltimore, Maryland, Dr. Morris Lazaron, who in February of 1935 got an indefinite paid leave from his congregation and traveled to Berlin. Lazaron was a national staff member for the National Conference of Christians and Jews in the United States, and his contacts in Berlin included leaders of the Jewish community as well as some clergy in the German Confessing Church. In fact, the archival documents suggest that the original invitation may have come from the Confessing Church. And in advance of his trip, Lazaron met with Christian and Jewish colleagues in the United States, as well as with William Dodd, the U.S. ambassador to Nazi Germany, and staff members of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. There were a number of American Christian and Jewish leaders who traveled to Nazi Germany in the early years of National Socialism on fact-finding trips or to assist the German Jewish community. But Lazaron's trip was different in that he intended to stay and work for interfaith understanding. He hoped, in fact, to replicate in Nazi Germany the models of interreligious understanding that the NCCJ, the National Conference of Christians and Jews, had been creating in the United States. That is, Lazaron's plan was to bring together Nazi Party members, Christian clergy, and leaders of the Jewish community to talk about their differences, look for common ground, and work together for the greater good. It's an interesting historical moment, one that a cynical colleague of mine described as the eternal naivete of the interfaith mind when I told him about it. But before I get more into the details of an outcome of Lazaron's trip, let me give a little bit of background into the world he came from and his own worldview. The National Conference of Christians and Jews, the NCCJ, had been founded in 1928 as an office of the Federal Council of Churches, the national Protestant ecumenical body in the United States. The NCCJ became an independent organization in 1932. It quickly gained prominence through its series of nationwide lectures, workshops, and programs that indeed brought Catholics, Protestants, and Jews together in the name of democratic values and tolerance. These were the words that they used. The NCCJ was a remarkable success story during the 1930s. It gained a national profile in the United States, gaining a prominent voice in newspapers and radio. The NCCJ founded something called National Brotherhood Week, as well as the news organization that is today known as Religion News Service. It held interfaith events at the White House with Roosevelt and helped create the Why We Fight newsreels during the Second World War, which featured Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic chaplains who talked about the moral significance of the battle against Nazi Germany and Japan. The NCCJ started with 2 part-time staffers in 1932. By 1949, it had a national staff of 275 people at 65 regional offices, a $2 million annual budget, and it had established 325 local interreligious committees around the United States, much of the interreligious work that's done in the United States today, in fact, dates from these original committees that were founded by the NCCJ. The NCCJ's success was due partly to the savvy entrepreneurship of its director, a man named Everett Clinchy, who was a Presbyterian minister and educator. But it was also because the NCCJ came on the scene at a very particular moment in US history that had parallels in some of what was going on in Europe. During the late 19th and early 20th century, there had been a rise in global awareness and what could be called internationalism among so-called mainline Protestants, the Protestant churches that emerged from the Reformation and their various offshoots. This was driven by the partnership between international missionary organizations and colonialism, and by growing liberalism in the US mainline churches. By the 20th century, Protestant churches had clergy and partner churches around the globe, And in the United States, there was growing cooperation among mainline Protestants around social issues. These Protestants were joined in many cases by Jewish and Catholic leaders, and it was also during this era that national organizations in the United States were founded to address social justice issues, such as racism, labor rights, and labor issues. In 1919, for example, the Roman Catholic Church, the Federal Council of Churches, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis issued a joint statement about labor issues such as the 12-hour workday and working conditions in the steel industry. Jewish and Christian clergy were involved in the founding of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909 and the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920. In Europe, before and following the First World War, there were similar developments. An international group of Protestant leaders, for example, became engaged in new pacifist organizations, such as the International Fellowship of Reconciliation, which was founded in 1919. There was also a growing commitment to interfaith and interdenominational relationships in North America and Europe. By the end of the 19th century, there were several Jewish Protestant dialogues on the localized level in the United States. The first international meeting of the Parliament of World Religions took place in 1893 in Chicago. There was even a small but growing number of voices in the international missionary movement itself who were promoting not just evangelization and conversion of local populations, but a different kind of encounter that respected the other religious traditions. During the interwar period in Europe, the Protestant ecumenical movement began to take shape, leading eventually to the establishment in Geneva of a World Council of Churches in process of formation, which then became the World Council of Churches in 1948. Jewish organizations were also internationally active during this period. The American Joint Distribution Committee was founded in 1914 to help Jews in Palestine and Europe. The Anti-Defamation League in the United States was founded in 1913 to combat specifically anti-Semitism, but also to defend the rights of all. The American Jewish Committee was founded in 1906. The World Jewish Congress was founded in 1936 in Geneva. All of these organizations found allies in the Federal Council of Churches, which had been founded in 1908 during the same period, as well as the social activist organizations I mentioned, such as the NAACP. In other words, by the 1920s, there was an international and interfaith network in place of organizations and individuals from different faiths who knew one another and were working together on various issues, such as the plight of refugees and the problem of anti-Semitism, issues that would become all the more crucial after 1933. During that same period, these trends were countered by a rising right-wing backlash throughout Europe and in the United States. In the wake of the First World War, new religiously linked ethno-nationalist groups began to emerge around Europe, notably the Iron Guard in Romania and what would become the German Christian movement in Germany. A fascist government came to power in Italy. The Bolshevik Revolution, of course, sent shockwaves among Protestant and Catholic leaders. And it was during this period in the United States that the so-called fundamentalist wars broke out, where Christian fundamentalists began to battle what they saw as the dangerous modernism of the liberal Protestant churches. In the United States during this period, there was also a dramatic revival of the Ku Klux Klan, which during that era was targeting not only African Americans, but Catholics and Jews. In other words, over the course of the 1920s, we find two contradictory, battling historical currents emerging and intensifying throughout the religious world. One was the religiously linked ethno-nationalist momentum that I just mentioned. While most of the ethno-nationalist movements in Slovakia, Romania, Russia, France, Italy, Germany, and some parts of Scandinavia did not emerge directly out of the churches, they all found allies within the Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant traditions, theologians, clergy, bishops, and lay people who began to give a religious language to these new impulses. the one thing they all shared, in addition to their nationalism, was a virulent anti-Semitism. And opposing these groups were the internationalist, ecumenical, and interfaith movements that I just described. They viewed the rise of ethno-nationalism as a serious threat, not only to the cause of interfaith and interdenominational understanding and cooperation, but to the fragile European peace itself. In particular, the European Protestant ecumenical movement began to focus during the 1920s on fears that these new versions of nationalism could provoke another European war. The Swiss ecumenist Adolf Keller warned against what he described as, his words, a new kind of religion, the religion of blood, rival, hostile, secular ecumenism, end of quote, that sought not common religious ground, but rather the establishment of churches along the divisive boundaries of race and nationalism. There were similar tensions in the United States, where the 1920s saw a new wave of nativism, anti-Catholicism, and anti-Semitism. American Catholics and Jews were deeply concerned about the attacks upon them, and this in fact led to their willingness to join the NCCJ. They were willing to work with mainline Protestants to fight these evils, and in turn, mainline Protestants interested in the so-called social gospel issues welcomed Jewish and Catholic allies on their issues of shared concern. And that was the background of Rabbi Lazarin's trip to Berlin. Lazarin and his circles were committed to building bridges, to intergroup and interfaith understanding, to preventing another war, and to working together on different social causes. They framed their engagement less in terms of doctrinal faith teachings and less in terms of theological dialogue, and more in terms of democratic ideals and the kinds of projects that could promote pluralism. Although after 1945, a core emphasis in Jewish-Christian relations has been theological dialogue, most, though not all, of the people I'm talking about here deliberately stayed away from it, finding it a divisive issue rather than one that could bring them together. Indeed, the condition for Catholics who became involved in the NCCJ, and I should note that many US Catholic bishops opposed to the organization, was that there could be no theological discussion because they opposed any equivalencies among different religions. Thus, the NCCJ had to focus on bringing people together around shared social and political concerns, especially the problem of anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic bigotry. The NCCJ argued that prejudice in all of its forms undermined the essential values of American democracy, and that Catholics, Jews, and Protestants needed to work together to combat such prejudice, whatever their theological differences. The only theological step that the NCCJ took early on, and for that era it was quite significant, was the repudiation of the evangelization and conversion of Jews to Christianity. So from the NCCJ perspective, the events unfolding in Nazi Germany after 1933 were an intergroup conflict, that was the kind of word they used, that could be fought through democratic ideals, dialogue, and mutual understanding. That perspective, interreligious work in the name of a broader pluralism and democratic values, was the lens through which Morris Lazarin viewed the events unfolding in Nazi Germany, and it was what he hoped to replicate when he got there. Shortly before his departure, he wrote to one of his Jewish contacts in Germany, Max Warburg, a Hamburg banker who would flee Nazi Germany in 1938. Lazarin's letter was idealistic. He wrote that what he hoped in Germany to work for was, his words, the second emancipation of the Jews. What is done in Germany will have implications for the status of the Jew throughout the continent, particularly in Middle and Eastern Europe, and may decide his fate for many years. There is no more delicate task that faces any Jew in the world today, end of quote. Morris Lazarin arrived in Berlin in mid-February of 1935, and by the end of his first week there, he was in a state of shock, having discovered that what confronted Jews in Nazi Germany was of an entirely different nature. He spent 4 months in Berlin, But instead of setting up dialogues between Nazis and Jews, he spent most of his time meeting secretly with Jews and Christians throughout Berlin. Most of his Christian contacts seem to have been from the confessing church, although he reached out to several Catholic leaders. He was besieged, however, by German Jews who had heard that there was an American rabbi in Berlin and desperately hoped that he could help them get a visa to the United States. Lazarin had to be cautious in his letters from Germany, but on a short trip to Italy in April, he wrote more openly to his NCCJ colleagues. He wrote his words, "It is utterly useless to attempt any liaison with the present regime. My work is clear, to stay as long as I can, absorb as much information as possible, and feed it to Christian as well as Jewish sources," end of quote. And when he returned to the United States in June of 1935, Lazarin wrote U.S. Jewish leader Paul Berwald, "No one who has seen what I've seen and heard what I've heard can ever be quite the same. It is a searing but sobering thing to go down into the abyss. Our people don't really know, deeply comprehend what this is all about, what is at stake. A malignant force has been let loose in the world against us," end of quote. It's a fascinating story for many reasons. First, it's a reminder that even in 1935, even well-intentioned outsiders didn't necessarily understand what was happening in Nazi Germany until they saw it firsthand. Morris Lazarin had to go to Berlin to fully grasp the nature of the threat that faced Germany's Jews. But it's also a reminder that throughout the 1930s, there was, in fact, a fairly steady stream of international religious figures, Protestants, Catholics, Jews, leaders, activists, refugee workers, journalists, who visited Europe, often traveled into Nazi Germany, and tried to respond to what was unfolding there. The NCCJ's first visit to Germany had in fact been in the summer of 1932, when Everett Clinchy traveled to Berlin with several colleagues from the Federal Council of Churches on a fact-finding trip that was focused on concerns about rising anti-Semitism. They spent several weeks in Berlin, meeting with German Quakers, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. One of their contacts was a man named Bernard Kahn, a Swedish-born physician who in 1901 had founded a Jewish welfare organization in Germany for refugees of the Eastern European pogroms and later worked for the Joint Distribution Committee. In 1932, Kahn was part of a small group of Jews and Christians in Berlin who were working together on social issues and greatly concerned about the rise of National Socialism. In fact, that summer he told Clinchy that if Hitler came to power, he would flee, which he did in 1933. Kahn's primary Protestant counterpart was a person I mentioned last night, a pastor named Friedrich Sigmund Schulze, the founder and director of a social welfare organization in East Berlin who would be deported by Nazis in July 1933 for his help to Jews. Clinchy returned to the United States in 1932 from his trip and wrote a little book called The Strange Case of Herr Hitler, trying to explain what was happening in Germany to Americans. It was published in early 1933, and raising awareness of the problem of anti-Semitism in Germany. Bernard Kahn went to Paris in 1933, where he set up an office that until 1939 would be a primary hub of contact for U.S. Jewish leaders and others who visited Europe, as well as for people like U.S. Refugee Commissioner James MacDonald and people trying to help Jews get out of Europe. In the years that followed, all these people were at the heart of a broader international network of very diverse figures and faiths that is all the more striking because they all seem to have known one another, worked with each other, met, consulted, and tried to push their respective governments, churches, and organizations to do something about what was happening in Nazi Germany and after 1939 about the disaster that began to unfold across Europe. Some of these people were individuals who helped critique or who had begun to critique and rethink Christian anti-Jewish teachings, The British Anglican James Parks, for example, falls in these circles. Another was a convert to Catholicism, the French philosopher Jacques Maritain. John Conley's wonderful 2012 book, From Enemy to Brother, traces an entire group of mostly Catholics throughout this period who already in the 1930s and 40s were beginning to lay the theological groundwork for Vatican II. Another recent work by Heinrich Wusterholz gives an extensive portrait of the efforts between Jews and Christians in Switzerland in their work to help refugees and begin a Jewish-Protestant dialogue there that began during the war and led to what I think is the earliest post-Holocaust Jewish-Christian statement, the 1945 Walzenhausen Declaration. There's even a new body of research that we found that we're promoting at the museum that looks at the engagement of Muslims in this kind of endeavor. Moroccan-born anthropology professor named Omar Boum, who now teaches at UCLA, was a visiting fellow at the museum several years ago, where he did a great deal of research in our North African archival collections. He has been doing research on an organization called the International League Against Anti-Semitism, LICA, which was founded in the 1920s by a French Jew named Bernard Lacache, the son of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants to France. Lacache wanted to raise awareness about the issue and organize Jews and non-Jews to combat racial and ethnic discrimination more broadly, somewhat like the approach of the NCCJ in the United States. In the early 1930s, Lacache became quite concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism in the French Algerian press and other parts of North Africa, as well as growing violence against Jews there. And so LICA established branches in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and Lacache began to reach out to Muslims throughout that region who were concerned about the rise in Arab nationalism and attacks on Jews throughout the region. He was joined in this work by several Muslim journalists. In 1937, an Egyptian writer, Hamid al-Maliji, published a pamphlet warning Muslims against the racist ideology of National Socialism. While Muslims, he wrote, might think they shared common cause with the Nazis in their fight against Jews, the fundamental racism of National Socialism meant that it would ultimately target Muslims as well. Furthermore, he argued, Nazi ideology was inherently anti-Islamic. One of the more stunning documents that Omar Boum found in our archives was a 52-page translation of excerpts from Mein Kampf, published in 1939 by an Algerian journalist, Abdurrahmani Fitravi, that consisted of material that had been omitted in the official German Arabic translations of that document, sections in which Hitler had written that Arabs were inferior barbarians who lacked culture and civilization. The pamphlet included a startling drawing of Hitler and Mussolini trampling on a copy of the Quran. Al-Maliji in his pamphlet included a bibliography of other German works on race and Aryan supremacy that had been translated into Arabic. When the Germans occupied Paris in 1940, the Gestapo closed the LICA office and Lacache fled to Algiers, where he sought allies throughout North Africa in his work and continued to mobilize underground. In many respects, the work of Lacache and his colleagues was similar to the approach that had been taken by the NCCJ, especially in terms of their message that any kind of prejudice might begin with one group of victims, but inevitably move on to others. LICA in North Africa tried to build alliances that focused on the larger issues, the bridge issues of economic and political integration, and portrayed anti-Semitism as a threat to the very fabric of society. For the most part, here people like James Parks are striking exceptions. The interfaith and Protestant ecumenical circles I've studied avoided or dismissed the crucial issues of theological anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, evangelization, and conversion. I think this is a fact that has been overlooked in the historiography of that era, but it's important if we are to understand both why they responded as they did, as well as to understand their failures. It is striking to see in the language of their correspondence, their statements, and their documents how they draw heavily on the language of civil liberties and human rights, and in the case of NCCJ, a broader defense of democracy. In the NCCJ especially, a fragile rapprochement had evolved between the Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish staff members that was based largely on a belief and a commitment to assimilation, a basic acceptance of a pluralist public square, and a shared commitment to certain liberal values. None of that, however, proved itself when the Nazis came to power. The quickness with which non-Jewish Germans abandoned their Jewish neighbors and colleagues illustrated to the outside world that assimilation and social cooperation were not necessarily strong enough to withstand anti-Semitism. And the effects of that became clear in the United States. The rise of the NCCJ during the 1920s and 1930s had been paralleled by a drop in Zionism among the Jewish population in the United States. In 1897, the Central Conference of American Rabbis had actually rejected what they called political Zionism in a statement that said in part, "The Jews are not a nation, but a religious community. America is our Zion," end of quote. Membership in the Zionist Organization of America dropped from 200,000 in 1918 to 800 in 1932, but that began to change dramatically as North American Jews began to witness what was unfolding in Nazi Germany. If assimilation had proven to be so superficial in a country like Germany, they reasoned, it wasn't something they could count upon in the United States. Most of the Jewish staff in the NCCJ, including Morris Lazarin, were and remained outspoken anti-Zionists. But the story of the NCCJ throughout the 1930s and 1940s became largely a story of what I call fault lines, deep lines of division over crucial issues between and within the respective faith communities. Despite their commitment to work toward interreligious understanding in the United States, for example, the Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic staff in the NCCJ were constantly wrestling with larger political issues on which they disagreed. American Catholics were very much focused on the Spanish Civil War during the 1930s and sided with the Spanish nationalists in that conflict. Most American Jews and Protestants supported the Loyalists, the Republicans. In 1939, U.S. Protestants became deeply divided between isolationists and interventionists with respect to the question of U.S. involvement in the Second World War. It was an internal battle that was difficult for American Jews to comprehend. There were similar tensions among European ecumenists, some of whom believed that the European peace must be maintained, whatever the cost. Others, notably Wilhelm Wissert Hooft in Geneva, who once the war began argued that the Nazis had to be decisively defeated. Such divisions took their toll on the personal relationships in these circles. When Lazarin returned to the United States in 1935, for example, he received a very different hearing among his Christian interreligious colleagues than within the Jewish community. Once Lazarin had experienced firsthand what German Jews were going through, he felt a personal sense of fear and vulnerability that his Christian colleagues in the NCCJ did not. The NCCJ issued decisive condemnations of what was happening in Nazi Germany, but many of them continued to see Nazi Germany through a very American lens and emphasized the importance of mediation and common ground. The NCCJ opposed the boycott of German goods in 1933 and a boycott of the 1936 Olympics because they feared that it would provoke anti-German prejudice in the United States, for example. By the mid-1930s, most American Jewish leaders dismissed the NCCJ, both because of its weak response to what was happening in Nazi Germany and because of the anti-Zionism of its Jewish staff. Even those who stayed in the NCCJ, like Lazarin, felt growing anguish about what was happening in Europe and increasing tensions with some of his colleagues. Such tensions played out in Europe as well. In 2000, I had the privilege of interviewing Gerhard Riegner, who had led the World Jewish Congress in Geneva and had met weekly during the war with Adolf Freudenberg, a Protestant German minister who coordinated ecumenical refugee efforts, and Willem Visser-Hooft, the Dutch ecumenical leader. In his memoirs, Regner wrote his words, "The humane comprehension, friendship, and helping hand of some of our Christian friends was the sole point of light in the darkness into which we had plunged," end of quote. Yet Regner told me that the friendship with Visser-Hooft essentially ended after the founding assembly of the World Council of Churches in 1948 refused to abandon and repudiate the evangelization of Jews. The friendship only resumed during the 1960s, when Visser-Hooft decided that it was time to examine the ecumenical movement's record with regard to the Holocaust and got back in touch with Regner. Nonetheless, it must be said that some of the strongest statements condemning the genocide of the Jews during that era emerged from these ecumenical and interfaith circles. At its biennial meeting on December 12, 1942, the Federal Council of Churches in the United States issued a statement about the events unfolding in Europe that remains one of the clearest condemnations of the genocide of the European Jews made at the time. It read in part, and I quote, "The reports which are reaching us concerning the incredible cruelties toward the Jews in Nazi-occupied countries, particularly Poland, stir the Christian people of America to the deepest sympathy and indignation. It is impossible to avoid the conclusion that something like a policy of deliberate extermination of the Jews of Europe is being carried out. The violence and inhumanity which Nazi leaders have publicly avowed toward all Jews are apparently now coming to a climax in a virtual massacre. We confess our own ineffectiveness in combating the influences which begat anti-Semitism in our own country, and we urge our constituencies to intensify their efforts on behalf of friendly relations with the Jews," end of quote. The FCC statement was a direct response to the information that had been sent in the famous Regner telegram, the message sent by Gerhard Regner in Switzerland to diplomats in the United States, that a full-scale genocide of the European Jews was being perpetrated across Europe. And the words of the FCC, Federal Council of Churches, did not find much of an echo among political leaders, the general public, or even among the pastors and members of their member congregations. The front page of the New York Times, the day that it appeared in the New York Times, the statement was tucked away on page 17 of the Times that day. The front page had the latest updates from the war and various other reports. And because it didn't find much of an echo back then, it hasn't found much of an echo in the history books. The same is true of other actions and statements made at the time by religious leaders in the United States, including the December 1938 condemnation of the so-called Kristallnacht pogroms that was issued jointly by the Federal Council of Churches and the Roman Catholic Church, nationwide radio broadcasts that same month about Kristallnacht made by Jewish and Christian clergy. January 1943, the heads of the 6 Jewish organizations in the Synagogic Council of America met together with federal council representatives to discuss renewed efforts to change refugee law in the United States. And in Europe, the World Council of Churches and the World Jewish Congress in Geneva jointly issued a declaration condemning the genocide of the Jews in March of 1943. And of course, there is the Archbishop of Canterbury, William Temple's impassioned speech in March 1943 to the House of Lords, calling upon Britain to let in more Jewish refugees. Moreover, ecumenical offices in Geneva laid the groundwork for action, not just statements. One of my colleagues at the Holocaust Museum, Rebecca Erbelding, is writing a definitive book, I think, on the American War Refugee Board. And she's told me that much of the funding that the United States government sent to help the Hungarian Jews in 1943-44 was actually sent through the ecumenical offices in Geneva. So what can we learn from all this? Historians work with documentation and details, but always with an eye to the historical bottom line. And the bottom line, of course, is the reality of the Holocaust and the failure to prevent it, and once it started, the failure to stop it before so many human beings were murdered. One cannot minimize this catastrophe, nor minimize the anti-Semitism that led to it, nor the many failures at all levels to respond to what was happening. There was not a sufficient response to Nazi Germany during the 1930s, and there was certainly not an effective response that stopped the genocide. From 1933 to 1945, the plight of the European Jews doesn't seem to have been on the top of anyone's set of priorities. Generally, for that reason, the historical verdict of the behavior of religious leaders, both inside and outside Nazi Germany, has been harsh. That is in part because we expect more of religious leaders. We certainly expect that people of faith, their focus would have indeed been on the plight of the victims and the human rights issues. It is also, as I noted, the fact that the perspectives that shaped so many of the ecumenical and interfaith pioneers of the early 20th century made them alert to issues of human rights and the vulnerabilities of European Jews, but less alert to the theologically driven prejudices that not only laid the groundwork for anti-Semitism, but shaped the reactions of Christian populations across Europe during this period. But these failures don't mean that people didn't know, or that they didn't care, or that there was nothing done at all. As I've shown this evening, there was not complete silence, and there were certainly individuals from all religious backgrounds who attempted to do something. Yet this history also illustrates that even when people act with the best of intentions, they do so with certain assumptions and out of certain contexts. Whether those were the realities of US and British public opinion that didn't support additional refugees, or Jewish leaders' worries about provoking further anti-Semitism in the United States, European ecumenical concerns about maintaining ties to the German churches, the Catholic focus on the Spanish Civil War, there were any number of shifting factors that constantly pushed the plight of European Jews from being given top priority. And even when they were focused, or when they were the focus, as in some of the church statements I've mentioned this evening, the international reactions were couched within the larger paradigm of how people saw the world. And I think the story of Lazaren's trip to Berlin shows that. The historian Henry Feingold once observed that during the Holocaust, many people believed, his words, that there exists such a spirit of civilization, a sense of humanitarian concern in the world, which could have been mobilized to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. But such a spirit, says Feingold, did not, in fact, exist, end of quote. The irony is that the ecumenical and interfaith movements I've described hoped and attempted to embody such a spirit. If we are to understand their attempts and their failures, I think we must reflect more deeply on the complexity of what they did and how they understood what they were trying to do. Thank you for your attention.